morning my son called to tell me I wasn't welcome at his wedding, I was standing in the back room of my bakery with flour on my apron and a 4-tier cake on the work table in front of me. His cake, the one I had been building for 3 days. I set the phone down on the counter and stared at it for a long moment. Outside, the early morning traffic on Maple Street was just starting to pick up. A delivery truck rumbled past the window. Someone honked twice. The world outside kept moving, the way it always does when something inside you goes very still. My son's name is Caleb. He is 34 years old, and he has my late husband's eyes and his grandmother's stubborn streak, and for most of his life, he has been the reason I kept going when keeping going felt impossible. If this story touches you, if it reminds you of something you've lived through yourself, I hope you'll subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. And before I go any further, I'm curious where you're watching from today and what time it is there. Leave it in the comments. These stories travel farther than we expect, but let me start at the beginning because the beginning matters. I opened Whitfield's bakery on a Tuesday in April, 26 years ago. The shop sat on a corner lot in Greensboro, North Carolina, with a green and white awning that I painted myself and a display window that fogged up every winter no matter how many times I had the seals replaced. My husband Raymond helped me hang the sign the night before we opened. He stood on a ladder in the dark with a flashlight clenched between his teeth, and when it was finally straight, he climbed down and said, "Now people will know where to find the best biscuits in Guilford County." He wasn't wrong. Caleb grew up in that bakery. When he was small, he used to sit on an overturned milk crate near the oven and watch me shape loaves. He wasn't interested in helping the way some children are. He didn't want to press cookie cutters into dough or lick the spoon after I mixed frosting. What he liked was watching. He'd sit very still with his small hands folded in his lap and study every movement I made, the way I crimped pie crusts, the way I smoothed fondant, the way I piped rosettes onto a birthday cake without looking down. When he was about 9, he said something that stayed with me for years. He looked up from his milk crate and said, "Mom, when I get married someday, will you make my cake?" I laughed because 9-year-old boys don't usually think about things like that. "Of course I will," I told him. "The biggest one you've ever seen." He nodded seriously, like we had just signed a contract. Raymond passed away 11 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, diagnosed in October, gone by February. That is the cruelest kind of loss, the kind that doesn't give you time to prepare. One season he was here and by spring he wasn't, and the bakery suddenly felt enormous and very quiet. I thought about selling. More than once, I sat in the back room after closing and looked at the equipment and the flour-dusted shelves and thought about what it would feel like to let it all go. But every time I got close to making that decision, I thought about Caleb. About a little boy on a milk crate. About a promise I had made so casually that I'd almost forgotten I meant it. So I stayed. I hired 2 part-time assistants. I took on more wedding orders than I probably should have. I worked early mornings and late evenings, and somewhere in the exhaustion and the routine, the grief became something I could carry instead of something that carried me. Caleb grew up and moved to Charlotte. He worked in commercial real estate, the kind of job that involves a lot of suits and conference rooms and dinners at restaurants with cloth napkins. He was good at it. Ambitious, focused. He called every Sunday without fail, and even when the calls got shorter as he got busier, they never stopped entirely. I was proud of him in the uncomplicated way that mothers are proud when their children build lives that look solid and bright. 2 years ago, he called on a Wednesday evening, which was unusual enough that I noticed. "Mom," he said, and his voice had that particular warmth in it that I recognized immediately. "I met someone." Her name was Sylvia Crane. She worked in wealth management. Her family was from Charleston, South Carolina. "Old money," Caleb said, in the careful tone people use when they're trying to make something sound like a simple fact and not a warning. I met Sylvia 4 months later at a dinner Caleb organized at a restaurant in Charlotte. She was beautiful in the composed, deliberate way that some women are, the kind of beauty that looks like it requires a certain amount of maintenance and intention. She shook my hand warmly. "Caleb has told me so much about you," she said. "The bakery sounds absolutely charming." Charming. I remember that word. I turned it over in my mind the whole drive home. Her mother, Constance Crane, was at that dinner too. She wore a silk blouse and a single strand of pearls and asked me questions about the bakery with the kind of polite interest that doesn't actually want answers. When I mentioned I'd been doing wedding cakes for 26 years, she smiled and said, "How lovely. Baking is such a comforting hobby." I told her it was my business. She smiled again and changed the subject. The engagement happened 7 months later. Caleb called me the moment it was official. He sounded happier than I'd heard him in years, and happiness in your child is the kind of thing that quiets everything else, at least for a while. "Mom," he said, "Sylvia wants you to make the cake." I closed my eyes briefly. "I wouldn't have it any other way," I told him. Over the next several months, I began designing the cake. Sylvia had specific ideas: 4 tiers, ivory fondant, sugar flowers in blush and cream, a style she described as elevated garden. I made 3 test versions before she was satisfied. I turned down 4 other wedding orders during that stretch because Caleb's cake required the kind of focused attention I couldn't split. The sugar flowers alone took 12 hours each session to complete. But this was my son's wedding. I didn't count the hours. Looking back now, I can see the pattern forming in those months, though at the time each moment felt too small to mean anything by itself. The first thing I noticed was the venue tour. Sylvia had found a property outside of Charlotte, a restored antebellum estate with a circular driveway and a ballroom that held 300 guests. "We're going Sunday," Caleb told me on a Thursday. I asked what time I should arrive. There was a pause. "Well, it's mostly going to be Sylvia and her parents and the coordinator. It's a pretty quick thing." I said of course. That made sense. I told myself I was probably reading too much into it. Then the tasting. Sylvia's family arranged a tasting with the caterer and didn't mention it to me until afterward. "I didn't realize you'd want to come to something like that," Sylvia said when I brought it up gently. "You weren't on the vendor's side for that one." Vendor's side. I repeated the phrase to myself on the drive home. Then the invitations. Sylvia's mother, Constance, had opinions about the invitation wording. The design, the font, the paper stock. These conversations happened by email, and I was not on those emails. What I was included on was a chain about payment schedules. Every time a deposit was due, someone reached out to me. The florist needed a confirmation. The venue required a balance. The lighting company was holding a date pending a deposit. I transferred the money each time without hesitation because that is what I understood my role to be. I told myself it was a generational thing, that Sylvia's family simply had a different way of doing things. I told myself Caleb was navigating 2 families and trying to keep the peace. Parents are very skilled at constructing explanations that let them sleep at night. The second time I met Constance Crane was at a dinner at Caleb's apartment. She arrived with Sylvia's father, a quiet man named Hugh who spent most of the evening discussing golf, and a brother I hadn't met before, a man in his early 40s named Foster. Foster Crane. He had Sylvia's coloring and an air about him that I couldn't quite name. Comfortable. Not friendly, exactly, just very comfortable the way people are when they've never had to wonder if they're welcome somewhere. The dinner was pleasant on the surface. Caleb had ordered from a good Italian restaurant and set the table carefully, and Sylvia moved between the kitchen and the dining room with the efficiency of someone who practices entertaining. But there were small moments. Foster mentioned something about a business opportunity he was pursuing, a boutique event venue project somewhere in the Charleston area. "We're in the soft launch phase," he said. "It's a lot of moving parts." Constance nodded approvingly. I noticed that Caleb didn't ask questions about it. Later, Constance asked me about the cake design. I described the sugar flowers, the tiers, the fondant work. She listened with her head tilted slightly. "And you be doing this all yourself?" she asked. "With my assistant," I said. "But yes, primarily." She nodded. "That's a lot of work for one person." I told her I'd been doing it for 26 years. She smiled and said, "Well, you must really love it." Something about the sentence made it sound like love was the only reason a person would do something like that, as if 26 years of skill counted for less than enthusiasm. Over the following weeks, my role in the wedding continued to shift in the same quiet, incremental way. I wasn't consulted about the rehearsal dinner venue. I wasn't asked about the timeline for the ceremony or the reception layout. But every time a vendor needed payment, My phone rang or my email chimed. I transferred money. I said of course. I kept building the cake. I want to be honest about something, because honesty is the only way this story makes sense. I didn't confront any of it directly. I watched and I noticed, and I told myself I was imagining things because the alternative, that my son was allowing me to be slowly erased from the wedding I was quietly funding, was something I wasn't ready to look at directly. The moment that changed everything came on a Tuesday afternoon in late September. I was in the back of the bakery reviewing invoices the way I do every month, a habit I learned from Raymond, who believed that money you don't track disappears faster than money you do. Wedding season always produces a thick folder of receipts and confirmations, and Caleb's wedding had become the largest personal project I had ever undertaken. The folder was enormous. I went through it page by page. Vendor deposits, sugar flour supply orders, specialty fondant shipments, a rental confirmation for a specialized tiered cake stand, and then I found something that didn't belong. An invoice labeled Crane Hospitality Group, LLC. The amount was $14,200, paid 6 weeks earlier. My debit card number was at the bottom. I didn't recognize the company. In 26 years of doing wedding cakes, I knew the catering vendors, the floral suppliers, the rental companies, the transportation services. Crane Hospitality Group didn't ring a bell. I pulled the invoice closer. The description read, Event Consulting and Soft Coordination, Phase 1. I turned to the next page, another invoice. Same company. $9,500, paid 3 weeks later. I set both papers on the counter and sat down on the stool near the work table. My hands were steady, but my mind was running fast. I had 2 vendors handling coordination. The wedding planner, a woman named Jillian, who specialized in high-end Charlotte events and whose contract I had on file with every payment completed, and a separate day of coordinator Sylvia had hired through the venue. There was no Phase 1 soft coordination in any of the contracts I had signed. I went back through my text messages with Caleb. 6 weeks earlier, he had sent me a message on a Tuesday afternoon. Hey Mom, Sylvia says the venue needs an additional operational deposit before they'll confirm the catering suite. It's time sensitive. That was the same date as the first payment. A few weeks later, another message, this time from Sylvia directly. Hi Ruth. The coordinator mentioned we need to cover an early setup fee for the outdoor lighting installation before they'll schedule the crew. That lined up with the second invoice. I sat there for a long time. My assistant Tammy came and went twice, asking questions I answered without really hearing. After she left for the afternoon, I called the one person I trusted to look at numbers without flinching. My neighbor and closest friend, Phyllis. She'd worked as a bookkeeper for 30 years before she retired, and she had the kind of steady, methodical mind that I've always admired. She answered on the second ring. Come over, I said. Bring your reading glasses. An hour later, Phyllis was at my kitchen table with both invoices spread out in front of her and her laptop open. She studied the documents carefully, the way she used to study ledgers, without expression and without rushing. Crane Hospitality Group, she said. She looked up at me. As in Crane, like Sylvia's family? I nodded slowly. She turned back to the laptop. She typed for a few minutes. Then she turned the screen toward me. A business registration page for Crane Hospitality Group, LLC. Registered in Charleston, South Carolina. Managing member Foster Crane. I felt the floor shift slightly under me. That's Sylvia's brother, I said. Phyllis nodded. She was already reading something else on the screen. And he's in the business of running a boutique event venue, she said. Or trying to be. There's a piece from a Charleston magazine about a property he purchased 18 months ago. She scrolled down. And here's a filing from 8 months ago about a contractor dispute on the same property. She looked at me over her glasses. This doesn't look like a company that does wedding coordination, Ruth. I said nothing. Phyllis clicked another tab. More records appeared. Outstanding vendor invoices, a judgment from a subcontractor. His project stalled, Phyllis said quietly. It looks like it's been stalled for a while. I looked at the 2 invoices on the table. $23,700 total. Money I had sent believing it was going toward my son's wedding. She turned the laptop fully toward me. There's one more thing. On the second invoice, in a field labeled Authorized By, there was a name. Sylvia Crane. The room got very quiet. Outside, the evening light was fading. Inside, the only sound was the refrigerator humming and Phyllis closing her laptop softly. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay in the dark and thought about the little boy on the milk crate. I thought about the promise I had made so easily. The way parents make promises without understanding how complicated the keeping of them will turn out to be. And I thought about my son, about whether he knew, about whether the woman he was about to marry had been honest with him about what was happening with my money. That last question was the one I couldn't move past. 2 days later, I drove to Charlotte without telling Caleb I was coming. I had the invoice folder on the seat beside me. The drive gave me 3 hours to rehearse the conversation and then abandon every version of it because there is no good script for something like this. Caleb answered the door in jeans and a t-shirt. He stared at me for a moment. "Mom, what are you doing here?" "I need to talk to you," I said. "Can I come in?" His apartment was neat, the way it always was. Sylvia had left her mark on it in small ways. Tasteful art on the walls, a new set of dishes visible through the open kitchen shelves, a throw blanket on the couch that looked expensive and decorative. I sat down in a chair near the window and set the folder on the coffee table. Caleb sat across from me and looked at the folder. Something in his face shifted. Just slightly, but I've known his face for 34 years. "What's Crane Hospitality Group?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. He looked at the folder, then at the window, then back at me. "Caleb," I said gently. He rubbed the back of his neck. "It's Foster's company, Sylvia's brother." "Yes." "And why did almost $24,000 from my account go there?" Caleb exhaled. He leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and looked at the carpet. For a moment, I let the silence sit. "She said it was for coordination support," he said finally. "She said." I kept my voice even. "Did you ask questions?" He looked up. I trusted her. "Did you know the money came from me?" A longer pause. "I knew you were covering some of the costs." "Covering some," I repeated. "Caleb, I've been transferring money for 8 months. The total is closer to $80,000. The number landed in the room and just sat there. Caleb's expression changed in a way that made me understand something important. He hadn't known the full amount. That much at least appeared to be true. "She handled the vendor side," he said slowly. "She said her family was covering a portion and that you were helping with the rest." "She told me the same thing in reverse," I said, "that you two were covering most of it and I was contributing." Caleb went quiet again. I watched his face as the arithmetic rearranged itself in his mind. "And Foster's company," I said, "was that coordination?" He shook his head slowly. "His venue project has been in trouble for over a year. He needed a bridge from my savings account." Caleb's jaw tightened. I didn't know that part. I believed him. I'm not sure that made it better. Then I asked the question I had been turning over for 2 days. "Does she know? Does Sylvia know exactly where the money went?" He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that I had my answer. "I think so," he said quietly. I nodded. I picked up the folder and set it on my lap. "There's one more thing I need to tell you," I said. Caleb looked at me. "Sylvia called me last week." He frowned. "About what?" "She said she'd been thinking about the guest list and that the venue's fire capacity was tighter than they had originally been told." I paused. "She suggested that given my setup schedule, it might be easier if I attended as a vendor rather than a guest." Caleb stared at me. "A vendor?" "Yes, at my wedding." "That's what she said." He stood up, slowly, the way a person moves when they're trying to keep control of themselves. He walked to the kitchen and stood with his back to me for a moment. I waited. When he turned around, his voice was careful and quiet. "She didn't tell me she said that to you." "I know, Mom, I'm sorry." "I know that too." I drove back to Greensboro that evening with the folder on the seat beside me and the windows down, even though it was cool. I needed the air. I needed to think. What I kept coming back to was not the money exactly. Money is recoverable. What I kept coming back to was the ease of it, the ease with which I had been moved to the edges of my own son's wedding, not shouted at, not confronted, just quietly repositioned, the way you move furniture in a room, 1 inch at a time, until the arrangement looks entirely different from what it started as. The wedding was 6 days away. I still had a cake to finish. I worked on it through the week. Every evening after closing, I went into the back room and worked on the sugar flowers. My hands knew what to do even when my mind was somewhere else entirely. Blush petals, cream centers, the delicate wire stems that would hold each bloom in place across 4 tiers of ivory fondant. It was the best work I'd ever done. I don't say that to be proud. I say it because I think my hands understood something I was still working out in my head. That whatever happened at that wedding, the cake was going to be exactly what I had promised. Caleb called me twice that week. Both times, he sounded strained and careful. He didn't mention what we had talked about. I didn't bring it up either. We were both waiting, though I wasn't sure either of us knew what we were waiting for. On the Thursday before the wedding, Phyllis came by the bakery after close and sat at the counter while I worked. She didn't say much. She just kept me company the way good friends do, understanding that sometimes presence is the entire thing. "Are you going to go?" she asked eventually. I kept my hands moving. "I'm delivering the cake, I'll stay to set it up." "That's not what I asked." I set down the petal I was working on. "I don't know yet," I said honestly. She nodded. She didn't press. Saturday arrived the way difficult days always do, faster than you expected and slower than you wanted. I loaded the van at 4:30 in the morning. The cake traveled in 4 separate boxes, carefully cushioned, the sugar flowers packed individually in tissue. Tammy rode with me to help with assembly. She had worked for me for 9 years and knew when to talk and when to keep quiet. That morning she kept quiet. The estate was outside Charlotte, on a property that managed to look both grand and effortless the way money often does. Long driveway lined with old oaks, a white columned house at the end of it, a side lawn that sloped toward a garden where the ceremony would be held. Staff was already moving across the grounds when we arrived. We set up in the reception hall, a high-ceilinged room with tall windows and a parquet floor that reflected the chandeliers above it. I assembled the cake on its stand and placed the sugar flowers in the arrangement I had planned for months. When it was done, I stepped back and looked at it. 4 tiers, ivory fondant, blush and cream flowers cascading down one side. It was beautiful. I allowed myself to feel that for a moment. Then I heard footsteps behind me. Constance Crane walked into the reception hall with a glass of something sparkling in her hand. She stopped when she saw the cake. "Oh," she said, "that's lovely." "Thank you." She circled it slowly. "You really did all of this yourself?" "My assistant helped with the transport," I said. "The cake is mine." Constance nodded. Then she said something that stayed with me. "Sylvia was right to have you do this. You really do have a gift." She said it the way people compliment someone's garden. Genuine but contained, like admiring something decorative that doesn't belong to your world. I turned toward her. "Where is Caleb this morning?" She looked mildly surprised by the directness of the question. "Getting ready with the groomsmen, I believe. Hugh is with him." I nodded. "And Sylvia?" "Upstairs," Constance said. "The girls are with her." She held my gaze for a moment. Something passed across her face, not quite discomfort, calculation. "Ruth," she said, and there was a different quality in her voice now. "I know this has been a complicated process, has it?" "Weddings are always complicated. Some more than others," I said. Constance tilted her head slightly. "I hope you understand that everything was meant to be handled as smoothly as possible." "I understand what it was meant to be," I said. She was quiet for a moment. "Foster will sort out the financial piece after the honeymoon," she said. "He's very close to closing on that project." I looked at her evenly. How close? She didn't answer that. I excused myself and walked out to the garden through a set of side doors. The morning air was cool and clean. Rows of white chairs were arranged in the grass, already half filled with guests arriving early. Strings of market lights had been hung between the old oaks. It looked like a photograph. A hand touched my shoulder. I turned. Caleb was standing there in his suit, looking more grown-up than I had ever seen him, and also, somehow, more like himself than he had in a long time. He had Raymond's eyes. He always has. "I didn't know you were here yet," he said. I got here early. The cake needed time. He nodded. For a moment we just stood there looking at the garden. Then he said quietly, "Mom, I talked to Sylvia last night. I waited. About all of it. And," he exhaled. "She said Foster told her the money would only pass through the account temporarily, that he'd return it before the wedding." "Did he?" "No." Caleb's voice was steady, but there was an edge underneath it. "She knew that. She's known for 3 weeks that he wasn't going to return it in time, and she didn't tell me. I didn't say anything." He looked at me. "And she never should have said what she said to you, about coming as a vendor." His jaw was tight. "That was wrong. I told her that directly." "How did she respond?" He paused. "She said she was trying to keep things simple." I looked at my son. He was holding himself very still, the way he used to as a child when he was trying hard not to show that something hurt. "Are you all right?" I asked. "No," he said, "but I will be." I put my hand on his arm. He put his hand over mine. We stood there for a moment. Around us, guests continued to arrive. Someone laughed across the garden. A child ran between the chairs. The world was preparing for a wedding. "Caleb," I said softly, "what are you going to do?" He looked at the ceremony arch, at the chairs, at the light strung through the oaks, at the ceremony arch, at the chairs, at the light strung through the oaks. Then he looked at me. "I'm going to go up there and tell her we need to be honest with each other before we stand up in front of all these people." I felt my chest tighten. "And if she's not willing to do that?" He was quiet. "Then we'll figure that out too," he said. He gave my hand a squeeze and walked back toward the house. I don't know exactly what was said upstairs in the hour that followed. Tammy found me standing near the garden entrance and brought me a cup of coffee, and we sat together on a bench under one of the oaks while the wedding planner moved through the grounds looking increasingly uncertain about the timeline. At some point, Constance came out through the side doors and walked quickly across the lawn toward the house. Her expression was closed and tight. Foster followed a few minutes later, talking on his phone with his hand cupped around it. Neither of them looked at me. Then Jillian, the wedding planner, approached me with the careful expression of someone delivering difficult news professionally. "There's going to be a slight delay in the ceremony," she said. 30 minutes, maybe more. I'll let the guests know." I thanked her. She moved on. The 30 minutes became an hour. The guests began to murmur. Some stood and gathered in small clusters near the refreshment table. Others remained seated and checked their phones. Then Caleb came back out. He walked across the garden and stood in front of the guests with a composure that made me deeply proud and deeply sad at the same time. He spoke clearly, without reading from anything. He thanked everyone for being there. He said there was something he and Sylvia needed to work through before they could proceed, and that out of respect for everyone in those chairs, he wanted to be honest about that rather than go through the motions. He said he hoped they would understand. He said the food and drinks were available and that he was grateful they had come. There was a silence after he finished speaking. Then a low murmur. A few people nodded. No one left, at least not immediately. People are more patient with honesty than we often give them credit for. Caleb came to where I was sitting. He looked tired in the way that comes from a particular kind of effort, not physical, the kind that uses something deeper. "She wasn't willing," he said simply. I took his hand. "I'm sorry. Don't be." He sat down beside me on the bench. "I've been feeling something off for months. I kept telling myself it was wedding stress." He looked out at the garden. "I think I knew. I just didn't want to know. I didn't say anything for a moment." Above us, the October light was coming through the oak leaves in the way that late morning light does in North Carolina, warm and slightly golden and very clear. "The cake is beautiful," he said finally. "It is," I agreed. He smiled, and it was a real one. "Can we take some home?" I laughed, which felt like the most unexpected and necessary thing in the world. "I'll box it up myself." We sat there a while longer. Eventually Tammy came over and asked if I needed anything, and I told her I was fine, which was only partly true but was becoming more true by the minute. Guests began moving toward their cars. Jillian supervised the quiet dismantling of the afternoon. Foster and Constance were gone. Sylvia, I was told, had gone upstairs and wasn't coming down. Caleb stayed beside me. That was the part I remembered later, when I was driving home in the evening and replaying the day. Not the confrontation, not the money, not the hollow look on Constance Crane's face when she understood that the careful arrangement she had built around her son's financial problems was coming apart. What I remembered was my son sitting next to me on a bench under an oak tree in the October light, holding my hand. There's something I've come to understand after 26 years of making wedding cakes and watching people begin their lives together in front of flowers and candles and everyone they love. A wedding is a single day. A marriage is everything that comes after. And everything that comes after is built from what you decide to be honest about before it begins. Caleb wasn't broken by that afternoon. He was, in some quiet way, himself again, more himself than he had been in months. And that, more than anything else, was what I had gone to Charlotte and asked those hard questions for. Not the money, not an apology, just my son. If you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace and speaking the truth, you know how costly that choice feels. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you think Caleb made the right call? Would you have done the same thing, or would you have waited? Let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. These stories have a way of finding the people who need them. And if you believe that honesty is the only real foundation a family can be built on, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Sometimes the most important things we have to say are the ones we've been putting off the longest. I've thought a lot about what it actually costs to keep quiet. Not the dramatic kind of silence, not the silence of someone who doesn't know what to say. The other kind. The silence of someone who sees something clearly and decides, for the sake of peace, to look somewhere else. That's the kind I practiced for months while I transferred money and told myself I was simply helping, that this was what mothers do, that I was reading too much into things. What I understand now is that silence isn't neutral. Every time I wired a payment without asking questions, I was making a choice. Every time I told myself Caleb was just navigating two families and that I should give it time, I was making a choice. The consequences of those choices didn't appear all at once. They accumulated the way debt does, quietly and then suddenly, until the morning I opened an invoice folder and found a company name I didn't recognize attached to my own bank account. That's the thing about cause and effect that nobody warns you about. The effect rarely announces itself. It doesn't knock on the door. It just shows up one afternoon when you're sitting on a stool in the back of your bakery with flour on your hands. And by then, the chain of events that led to it is already very long. What Sylvia built, she built one small deception at a time. One redirected payment. One conversation I wasn't included in. One carefully worded suggestion that I attend my own son's wedding as a vendor. None of those things taken alone looks like what it actually was. Together they were a system. And systems like that only work because someone on the other end keeps accepting the terms without reading them closely. I don't say this to be hard on myself. I say it because I think it's true, and because I think a lot of people reading this know exactly what I mean. We accept things we shouldn't accept because we love someone, because we don't want to be the one who causes trouble, because we've told ourselves that the relationship matters more than the moment. Sometimes that's wisdom. Sometimes it's just a longer way of arriving at the same painful place. What I'm proud of is what happened when I finally stopped looking the other way. Not the confrontation with Sylvia, not the wedding that didn't happen. What I'm proud of is that Caleb, when he had the full picture, chose truth over appearances. That he walked out in front of 300 people and told them honestly that something needed to be worked through before he could stand at that altar. That took more courage than most people will ever have to demonstrate in public, and he did it without flinching. That didn't come from nowhere. It came from the same place everything real comes from. The decision to value honesty even when it costs something. Caleb made that decision when it mattered most, and I believe he made it, at least in part, because he grew up watching a woman who kept her word for 26 years, who promised a little boy a wedding cake and built it with her own hands even when the circumstances made that promise complicated and painful and uncertain. The cake was beautiful. We took it home. And that, more than anything else, felt like the right ending to that particular day.